The sky hung like hammered brass over the Badlands, its color neither gold nor copper, but something between the shade of drought and dying things. Wyatt McGraw pulled his hat lower against the glare, squinting at the horizon where heat devils danced above the cracked earth. His horse, a sturdy bay named Moses, picked its way through the sagebrush with the careful steps of an animal that knew water was scarce and shade was memory. Wyatt had been riding since dawn, following the ghost of a trail that might lead to the next town, or might peter out into nothing but scorched rock and regret. At 34, he'd learned not to trust much beyond what his eyes could see and his hands could hold. The Colt at his hip was loaded, the canteen at his saddle half full, and the ache in his bones spoke of too many nights sleeping on hard ground. The wind picked up, carrying grit that stung like needles. Moses snorted and shook his head, and that's when Wyatt heard a sound that didn't belong to the desert's usual symphony of silence and suffering. Somewhere ahead, a horse was screaming. He pressed his heels to Moses's flanks, urging the gelding into a reluctant trot. The sound grew louder, more desperate, mixing with the crash of wood and the metallic ring of something being struck repeatedly. Wyatt's hand moved to his pistol as he crested a low rise and saw the source of the commotion. Below, in a hollow that might once have held water, stood the skeleton of an old way station. Its walls were bleached white as old bones, the roof half caved in, windows empty as a dead man's stare. In what remained of the corral, a paint mare thrashed against the rails, eyes rolling white with terror. Wyatt approached slowly, Moses dancing sideways as the mare's panic infected him. There was no smoke from the chimney, no movement save the terrified horse. The place reeked of abandonment. Yet something had spooked that mare badly enough to risk breaking her legs against the fence. He dismounted, looping Moses's reins around a sturdy post, and drew his Colt. The door to the station hung askew on rusted hinges. Wyatt pushed it open with his boot, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness within. The smell hit him first, sweat and fear and something else, something that made his jaw clench. As shapes resolved in the gloom, he saw overturned furniture, empty bottles scattered like fallen soldiers. And then, his breath caught. In the center of the room, tied to a support post, was a woman. Her dress, once white or cream, was torn and stained with dirt and what might have been blood. Her head hung forward, dark hair falling like a curtain, but it was the sign hanging around her neck that made Wyatt's blood turn to ice water. "Take as you please," was scrawled in charcoal on a piece of board. The letters crude but clear. For a moment, Wyatt stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Then the woman stirred, lifting her head slightly, and he saw her face. Young couldn't be more than 22 or 3, pretty, despite the bruise darkening her left cheek and the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. But it was her eyes that struck him like a physical blow, green as spring grass. They held pain, yes, but also a fierce determination that hadn't been broken despite whatever hell she'd endured. Those eyes met his, and he saw the flash of fear before she recognized he wasn't one of them, whoever they had been. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Wyatt holstered his gun and pulled out his knife, approaching slowly, hands visible. "Easy now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "I'm going to cut you loose." She flinched when he reached for the ropes, and he paused. "I ain't going to hurt you," he said, softer. "My name's Wyatt McGraw. I'm just passing through." The rope was thick, the knots tight. Someone had meant for her to stay put. As he worked, he kept his eyes on the task, giving her what privacy he could despite the circumstances. The sign around her neck swayed with each movement, those ugly words catching the light. When the last rope fell away, she swayed, and he caught her elbow to steady her. She jerked back, then seemed to realize she couldn't stand on her own. Her legs had gone numb from being tied. Wyatt shrugged out of his duster and draped it around her shoulders, large enough to cover her torn dress and that damnable sign. She clutched it closed with shaking hands. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded, then winced at the movement. "There's a mare outside. Probably yours." Another nod. He helped her to the door, supporting her weight when her legs buckled. Outside, the paint mare had calmed somewhat, though she still paced the confines of the corral. The woman made a soft sound, and the mare's ears pricked forward. "Belle," she whispered, and it was the first word he'd heard from her. Her voice was hoarse, probably from screaming. The thought made his hands clench. While she leaned against the doorframe, Wyatt caught the mare and saddled her with tack he found in the ruins of the station's lean-to. The saddle was a side saddle, confirming his suspicion that the woman had been traveling alone or with family when she'd been taken. He helped her mount, then swung up on Moses. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, and the wind carried the smell of rain, rare and precious in this country, but dangerous if you were caught in the open during a flash flood. "My place is about 10 miles north," he said. "We can make it before that storm hits if we push." She looked at him then, really looked at him, studying his face like she was trying to read his soul. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she gathered Belle's reins and nodded. They rode in silence, Wyatt setting a pace that wouldn't tax the woman's strength. He kept glancing back, partly to make sure she was keeping up, partly because he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had done this might come back. The storm chased them across the desert, lightning forking down to strike the distant mesas. Thunder rolled like artillery fire, and the first fat drops of rain were falling when Wyatt's ranch came into view. It wasn't much a small adobe house, a barn that leaned slightly to the west, a corral that needed mending, but it was his, bought with 5 years of working cattle drives and saved wages. He helped her dismount and led both horses into the barn, working quickly to unsaddle them before the storm hit in earnest. The woman stood in the doorway, his coat still wrapped around her, watching the approaching wall of rain. "Thank you," she said suddenly, so soft he almost missed it under the sound of thunder. Wyatt paused in rubbing down Moses. "No need for thanks. Any decent man would have done the same." She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. "Decent men are scarce in these parts." He couldn't argue with that. The rain hit like a cavalry charge, turning the world gray and washing the dust from everything. Wyatt gestured toward the house. "Come on, let's get inside before we drown." The house was simple, one main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom, a lean-to kitchen. Wyatt lit a lamp and stirred the banked coals in the fireplace back to life. The woman stood just inside the door, dripping and uncertain. "Bedroom's through there," he said, jerking his thumb toward the door. "There's some clothes in the trunk belong to my sister. She won't mind if you borrow them." He didn't mention that Mary had been dead 3 years, taken by the fever. "I'll heat some water so you can wash up." While she changed, Wyatt busied himself making coffee and heating beans and salt pork. It wasn't much, but it was hot food, and that counted for something. When she emerged, wearing Mary's blue dress that was too big for her slim frame, she'd washed her face and tried to tidy her hair. The sign was gone, probably thrown in the fire, though he could still see the raw marks on her neck where the cord had rubbed. They ate in silence, broken only by the sound of rain on the roof. Finally, as Wyatt poured more coffee, she spoke. "Lillian Hart," she said. "My name is Lillian Hart." It was a gift, that name, offered like a test. Wyatt nodded, accepting it. "Where were you headed, Miss Hart?" "California. My aunt lives in Sacramento." She stared into her coffee cup. "I was traveling with a family, the Millers. They were killed 2 days ago. Bandits. I thought at first, but bandits would have just robbed you." Her hands tightened on the cup. "Yes." Wyatt didn't push. She'd tell him, or she wouldn't, in her own time. The rain hammered harder, and somewhere in the distance, lightning struck with a crack like the world splitting. "You can stay as long as you need," he said finally. "Storm will probably last through the night anyway. Come morning, we can figure out what to do." She looked at him again with those green eyes that had seen too much. Why? Why what? Why help me? You don't know me. I could be... She trailed off, but he heard what she didn't say. I could be what that sign said I was. Wyatt stood and collected the dishes, uncomfortable with the weight of her gaze. My ma used to say that we're judged not by what others do to us, but by what we do for others. He paused at the kitchen door. Besides, I know what it's like to be left with nothing but the clothes on your back and nowhere to go. Wouldn't wish that on anyone. When he came back from washing the dishes, she was still at the table, but some of the rigid tension had left her shoulders. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. I'll bed down out here, Wyatt said, pulling blankets from a chest. You take the bedroom. There's a bar for the door if it makes you feel safer. She rose, then hesitated. Mr. McGraw, what you said about decent men being scarce. You're wrong. There's at least one. Then she was gone, the bedroom door closing softly behind her. Wyatt spread his blankets by the fire and lay down fully clothed, his gun within reach, outside. The storm raged on, but inside the small adobe house, there was warmth and quiet and the strange peace that comes from doing what's right, even when the world says it's foolish. As sleep finally took him, Wyatt thought he heard singing from the bedroom, soft and low, a hymn he remembered from childhood. The sound followed him into dreams where the sky wasn't brass but blue, and the earth wasn't cracked but green with promise. The morning came wrapped in the smell of wet earth and coffee. Wyatt woke to find his back protesting the night spent on hardboards, but the rain had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Through the window, the desert looked almost green in the early light, though he knew that was just a trick of the eye. He stirred the fire back to life and set coffee to boiling, moving quiet as he could, but when he turned from the stove, Lillian stood in the bedroom doorway, still wearing Mary's blue dress. In the morning light, he could see the exhaustion etched in her face, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. Morning, he said, suddenly aware of how small the room felt with both of them in it. Good morning. She moved to the table, each step careful, like she was testing whether the world was solid beneath her feet. I heard you moving about. Wyatt poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the bitter smell filling the space between them. She wrapped her hands around the cup like it was an anchor, and they sat across from each other at the scarred wooden table. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Wyatt cleared his throat. I need to ride into town today. Get supplies. You're welcome to come, or you can stay here if you'd rather. Her knuckles went white around the cup. Town, she repeated, and the words sounded like a stone dropped in still water. Red Bluff. It's not much, couple dozen buildings. A general store. Church, if you're inclined. He studied her face, trying to read what was behind those green eyes. People there are, well, they're people. Some good, some not. But they'll talk. They always do. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. She set the cup down with trembling hands. Mr. McGraw, I should leave. Today. What happened? What was done? It marks a person. That mark follows them, and it'll follow you too if I stay. Wyatt had expected this, had lain awake half the night thinking about it. Actually, he stood and went to the window, looking out at his land, 40 acres of scrub and possibility. You know what I see out there? He asked, not turning around. Land that don't care about nothing but whether you work it honest. Sun comes up, sun goes down. Seasons turn, that's all that matters. He faced her then. Let them talk. Their tongues are cheap. She searched his face like she was looking for the lie, the trap, the moment when he'd show his true colors. When she didn't find it, something in her shoulders eased just a fraction. I can work, she said quietly. I can cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden. Never said you would be. He refilled their cups. But you don't owe me nothing. Miss Hart, that ain't why I brought you here. I know. And the way she said it, he believed she did know. But I need to do something. I can't just... She gestured helplessly. I can't just sit and remember. Wyatt understood that. After Mary died, after Sarah left him for that merchant in Kansas City, he'd thrown himself into work until his hands bled and his body was too tired to think. All right, then. He said, we'll go to town. Face it straight on. She nodded, chin lifting with something that might have been courage or might have been desperation dressed up pretty. They rode into Red Bluff as the sun climbed toward noon. Wyatt had found an old split skirt of Mary's that fit Lillian better, and she sat Belle with a straight back that spoke of proper upbringing. But he noticed how her hands shook on the reins when the first buildings came into view. Red Bluff wasn't much to look at, a main street of false-fronted buildings, wood sidewalks that turned to mud when it rained, and dust that coated everything in between. The largest building was Murphy's General Store, with the Silver Dollar Saloon running a close second, at the far end of town. The white steeple of the Methodist Church pointed at heaven like an accusing finger. People noticed them right away. Wyatt McGraw didn't often come to town, and never with a woman. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Martha Henderson paused in sweeping her porch to stare. Tom Baker, the blacksmith, let his hammer fall silent. Wyatt helped Lillian dismount in front of Murphy's, and they walked into the store together. The bell above the door sounded too loud in the sudden quiet. McGraw. Sam Murphy nodded from behind the counter, his eyes sliding to Lillian with obvious curiosity. Ma'am. Murphy. Wyatt pulled out his list. Need the usual? Coffee, flour, salt pork, some calico if you've got it. Calico? Murphy's eyebrows rose. Everyone knew Wyatt McGraw had lived alone since his sister passed. That's what I said. While Murphy filled the order, Lillian wandered to the fabric display, running her fingers over the patterns with absent attention. Wyatt watched her from the corner of his eye, saw how she kept her shoulders square even as whispers started behind the pickle barrels. The bell jangled again. Mrs. Abigail Foster swept in, the self-appointed moral guardian of Red Bluff, her gaze fixed on Lillian like a hawk spotting a rabbit. Why, Mr. McGraw, she said, her voice sweet as sorghum and twice as thick. How unexpected to see you in town, and with company. Wyatt turned, keeping his expression neutral. Mrs. Foster. I don't believe I've had the pleasure, she continued, moving toward Lillian with the determination of a woman on a mission. I'm Mrs. Foster, president of the Ladies' Temperance Society. Lillian looked up from the fabric, and Wyatt saw the moment she decided to stand her ground. Lillian Hart, she said, offering neither explanation nor apology. Hart, Mrs. Foster rolled the name around like she was tasting it for scandal. I don't recall any Harts in these parts. Are you visiting, dear... Miss Hart's staying at my place for a spell. Wyatt cut in, moving to stand beside Lillian. Had some trouble on the trail. Trouble. Mrs. Foster's eyes glittered with the hunger of someone who fed on other people's misfortune. How unfortunate. And you're staying at Mr. McGraw's ranch alone, how irregular. The store had gone dead quiet. Even Murphy had stopped pretending to work, watching the confrontation with the attention of a man viewing a prize fight. Nothing irregular about offering shelter to someone in need, Wyatt said, his voice carrying a warning that Mrs. Foster chose to ignore. Of course not. Christian charity is always admirable, though one must be careful about appearances. A young woman's reputation is such a fragile thing. Her smile was sharp as glass. Once damaged, it's nearly impossible to repair. Lillian's hand found the counter for support, but her voice was steady. I appreciate your concern. Mrs. Foster, But I've learned that those who worry most about others' reputations often have the least charity in their hearts. The older woman's face went red as a turkey's wattle. Well, I never— No, Lillian said quietly. I don't imagine you have— Wyatt coughed to cover what might have been a laugh. Murphy, that order ready? Yes, yes. Murphy hastily shoved goods into a crate. That'll be $2.40. Wyatt paid, hefted the crate, and gestured for Lillian to precede him out. She walked past Mrs. Foster with her head high, but he saw the tremor in her hands. Outside, the sun beat down merciless as judgment. They loaded the supplies in silence, aware of faces in windows, of conversations resuming behind closed doors. It'll be all over town by sundown, Lillian said as they rode out. Let it. You don't understand. They'll make assumptions about you, about why you're keeping me there. Wyatt reined Moses to a stop, waiting until she did the same with Belle. Miss Hart, I'm 34 years old. I've been shot at, snake-bit, near drowned in the Brazos, and left at the altar. I've buried my sister and most of my illusions. What I got left is that ranch and my good sense, and neither one of them cares what Abigail Foster thinks. She studied him, this woman who'd been marked for shame and survived it. You're either the kindest man I've met or the biggest fool. Probably both, he admitted, and was rewarded with something that was almost a smile. Back at the ranch, they fell into an awkward dance of domesticity. Lillian insisted on taking over the cooking, and Wyatt had to admit she was better at it than he was. She moved around the small kitchen like she was afraid of taking up too much space, but gradually, as the afternoon wore on, she seemed to settle. While she cooked, Wyatt worked on mending the corral fence, but his mind kept wandering to the house, to the soft sound of her humming not quite a song, just a melody that seemed to help her think, to the way the late afternoon light caught in her dark hair when she stepped onto the porch to shake out a dish rag. Supper was simple beans and cornbread, but it tasted like a feast after months of his own cooking. They ate as the sun painted the desert gold and crimson. I had a husband, she said suddenly, staring at her plate. Edward Hart. He died of fever 6 months ago in Missouri. That's why I was heading to California. Nothing left for me back there. Wyatt set down his fork. I'm sorry. He was a good man. Gentle. He would have been horrified by what— She stopped, took a breath. That's what makes it worse. Somehow, that he's not here to be horrified. You loved him. I did, not the way the novels describe it, all fire and passion, but steadily, quietly. She looked up at him. Do you think that's wrong to have loved quietly? Wyatt thought of Sarah, of the way she'd burned bright and fast before leaving him for a man with clean hands and a shop that didn't smell of cattle. I think love's too rare to judge how it comes. They finished the meal in companionable silence. As Lillian cleared the dishes, Wyatt lit his pipe and stepped onto the porch. The first stars were appearing, and somewhere a coyote sang its lonesome song. He heard her come out behind him, but didn't turn. She stood beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd used. Thank you, she said, for today, for standing up to that woman. You stood up for yourself just fine. I was terrified. Didn't show. She laughed, soft and surprised. I used to be good at that, pretending things didn't touch me. Edward used to say I had a poker face that could fool the devil himself. Useful skill to have. Yes, her voice went distant. Until you meet devils who don't care what face you wear. The coyote called again, answered by another, and another, until the night filled with their wild chorus. Lillian shivered despite the warmth. I should go in, she said. Early day tomorrow. Miss Hart. He still didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the darkening horizon. Whatever happened back at that way station, whatever was done, that's their shame, not yours. Don't let them put it on you. He heard her sharp intake of breath, felt rather than saw her nod. Then she was gone, the door closing soft behind her. Wyatt stayed on the porch a long time, smoking and thinking. When he finally went inside, he could see lamplight under her door and hear the quiet rustle of pages turning. She'd found Mary's Bible, probably. He banked the fire and spread his blankets. But sleep was a long time coming. Through the thin walls, he heard her crying muffled, trying to be quiet, but crying all the same. It was the sound of grief finally allowed its voice, and it tore at something in his chest. But he didn't go to her. Some sorrows needed to be met alone before they could be shared. So he lay in the dark and listened to the rain that wasn't coming, to the wind that whispered secrets to the desert, to the sound of a woman learning how to survive what shouldn't be survivable. Tomorrow would bring what it brought: more whispers, more judgment, more of misses. Foster's particular brand of poison. But tonight, there was shelter and safety, and the quiet understanding between two people who'd learned that kindness was both the simplest and hardest thing in the world. When her crying finally stopped and the house settled into sleep, Wyatt allowed himself to close his eyes. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, it was enough that they'd both made it through another day. The days settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Wyatt would rise before dawn to tend the stock, and by the time he returned to the house, coffee would be ready and breakfast warming on the stove. Lillian moved through the domestic tasks with quiet efficiency, but he noticed the small things. She added wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, curtains fashioned from the calico they'd bought, the floors swept so clean they almost gleamed. It had been 2 weeks since he'd found her at that way station, and the bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green shadows. But other wounds ran deeper, showing in the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the way her hands sometimes trembled for no reason he could see. This morning, she was kneading bread when he came in, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender arms dusted with flour. She'd taken to humming while she worked old hymns mostly, but sometimes songs he didn't recognize. The sound had become part of the fabric of his days. "Storm coming," he said, pouring himself coffee. "Probably hit by afternoon." She glanced toward the window where clouds gathered like an army on the horizon. "I should bring in the washing then." "I'll help." They worked in companionable silence, pulling sheets and clothes from the line as the wind picked up. Lillian's hair whipped around her face, and she laughed as a pillowcase tried to escape her grasp. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh freely, without that edge of bitterness, and the sound stopped him mid-motion. She noticed him staring and flushed. "I must look a sight." "You look—" He caught himself, turned back to the washing. "You look fine." The moment hung between them, delicate as spun glass, before the first fat raindrops broke it. They ran for the house, arms full of clean laundry, laughing like children as the sky opened up. Inside, they stood dripping and breathless, and Wyatt was suddenly aware of how close they were, how her eyes sparkled with something other than tears. "These need folding," she said, stepping back. "Right, I'll check the barn." He fled to the safety of the horses and the smell of hay, cursing himself for a fool. She was under his protection, dependent on his goodwill. The last thing she needed was him looking at her like what? Like a woman instead of a wounded bird. Thunder crashed overhead, and Moses whickered nervously. Wyatt soothed the horses, checked the roof for leaks, and did every other chore he could think of before admitting he was hiding. When he finally returned to the house, Lillian had changed into a dry dress and was stirring something on the stove that smelled like heaven. "Soup," she said without looking up. "Seemed like a good day for it." They ate while the storm raged outside, the small house a haven against the violence of wind and rain. Wyatt told her about the time he'd been caught in a tornado in Kansas, and she countered with a story about a blizzard in Missouri that had trapped her and Edward in their house for a week. "We ran out of coffee on day 3, she said, smiling at the memory. Edward nearly went mad. He tried to make tea from pine needles. How'd that work out? About as well as you'd expect, though he claimed it tasted like Christmas. They were still talking when the rain tapered off and the sun broke through, painting everything gold. Lillian stood to clear the dishes, then paused at the window. "Mr. McGraw, there's someone coming!" Wyatt joined her, saw the buggy approaching through the mud. His jaw tightened when he recognized it. "That's Reverend Morrison, from the church." Lillian's hand went to her throat. "On a Thursday." "Seems so." They waited on the porch as the Reverend navigated the puddles. He was a thin man with a face like an underfed hawk, all sharp angles and disapproval. Mr. McGraw." He climbed down from the buggy, fastidiously avoiding the worst of the mud. "Miss—" He paused. "Waiting." "Hart," Lillian supplied, her voice steady. "Miss Hart, I've come on a matter of some delicacy." "Then you'd best come in," Wyatt said, though he wanted nothing more than to send the man packing. Inside, Morrison perched on the edge of a chair like he was afraid of contamination. He accepted coffee but didn't drink it, just held the cup like a prop. "I'll come straight to the point," he said. "There's been talk, considerable talk, about the irregular nature of Miss Hart's presence here." "Nothing irregular about it," Wyatt said. "I've told folks that." "Yes, but you must understand, the appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as impropriety itself, to both your reputations." Lillian set down her cup carefully. "Reverend Morrison, are you here out of Christian concern, or because Mrs. Foster sent you?" 2 spots of color appeared on his cheeks. "The Ladies' Temperance Society is naturally concerned." "Naturally." Her tone could have etched glass. "Miss Hart, I understand you've been through some difficulty, but surely you must see that continuing to reside here, unchaperoned, with an unmarried man—" "What would you have me do?" She stood abruptly. "Where would you have me go, or didn't your Christian concern extend that far?" Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "I'm sure arrangements could be made. Perhaps one of the ladies in town—" "The same ladies who cross the street to avoid me, who whisper behind their hands when I pass." Lillian's voice rose. "The ones who've already judged and condemned me for something that was done to me. Miss Hart." "No." She was trembling now, but with anger, not fear. "You weren't there. You didn't see, but you'll sit in judgment anyway. All of you, because it's easier than showing actual mercy." Wyatt stood. "I think you'd better go." "Reverend—" Morrison rose, clutching his hat. "Mr. Y. McGraw, I'm trying to help. If you continue down this path, I fear what the consequences might be, for both of you. The only path I'm on is the one where I don't throw a woman in need out of my house because some biddy's got nothing better to do than gossip." "Then I'll pray for you both," Morrison said stiffly. "And I hope you'll consider attending services on Sunday. Perhaps if the community saw you both in church." "We'll think about it," Wyatt said, just to get him moving toward the door. After the buggy squelched away, Lillian sank into a chair, the fight going out of her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have—" "You said what needed saying." "Did I?" She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Or did I just make everything worse?" Wyatt didn't have an answer for that. Sunday came too soon. Lillian emerged from her room wearing her best dress, the blue one of Mary's that she'd altered to fit. She'd done something elaborate with her hair, and the effect was startling. She looked like a lady, refined and untouchable. "You sure about this?" he asked. Her chin came up. "They want to see the Scarlet Woman. Let them look their fill." The ride to town was silent, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. The church bells were already ringing when they arrived, and the steps were crowded with folks in their Sunday best. Conversations stopped as Wyatt helped Lillian down from the wagon. He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together they climbed the steps, running a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Inside, The usual scramble for pews had left the back rows empty. They slid into the last bench, and Wyatt tried to ignore the way heads turned. The way Mrs. Foster leaned over to whisper urgently to Mrs. Henderson. Reverend Morrison took the pulpit, and his eyes found them immediately. His sermon was about Mary Magdalene, and it didn't take a scholar to understand the message. Sin, redemption, the casting of stones, every word was aimed at the back pew like an arrow. Beside him, Lillian sat rigid as stone, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. When the congregation rose to sing, her voice was barely a whisper at first, but as the hymn continued, she sang louder, clearer, until her voice soared above the others, pure and defiant. Wyatt had never been much of a singer, but he added his rough baritone to hers, and together they sang as if the words were a shield against all the judgment in the room. When the service ended, people filed out slowly, many pausing to stare. Lillian kept her eyes forward, moving with a grace that made her seem to float above their pettiness. Outside, Mrs. Foster lay in wait like a righteous spider. "Miss Hart," she said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "How brave of you to come to church, though one wonders if those who've fallen so far can truly find redemption." Lillian stopped. For a moment, Wyatt thought she'd keep that dignified silence. Then she turned, and her smile was terrible in its sweetness. "Judge not, Mrs. Foster, lest ye be judged. Isn't that what the good book says? Though I suppose some folks prefer the parts about casting stones. How dare you quote scripture to me, you, who bears the mark of shame? The only marks I bear are the ones put there by cruel hands and crueler tongues." Lillian's voice carried clear across the churchyard. "But you're right, Mrs. Foster. I have been marked as a survivor, marked as someone who knows exactly what good Christian charity looks like and what it doesn't." She turned her back on the sputtering woman and walked to the wagon, head high. Wyatt followed, trying not to grin at the expression on Mrs. Foster's face. They were halfway home before either spoke. "I shouldn't have done that," Lillian said. "Probably not. But Lord, it felt good." This time Wyatt did grin. "I bet it did." She glanced at him sideways. "You're not angry." "Why would I be angry? Woman had it coming." "Most men would be embarrassed, having the woman there, protecting, make a scene like that. Most men are fools." She laughed then, really laughed, and the sound filled the space between them with something warm and alive. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Lillian broke a long silence. "I should go," she said quietly. "This is only going to get worse. Your reputation will survive just fine. You don't understand. A ruined woman is like poison. It seeps into everything around her." Wyatt knocked his pipe against the porch rail, choosing his words carefully. "You know what ruins a woman? Miss Hart folks deciding she's ruined. That's all. Just words and judgment and people with nothing better to do than tear others down." She turned to look at him in the dim light. "You really believe that? I believe you're no more ruined than that land out there. Maybe there was a fire. Maybe things got burned down to nothing. But the rain comes, the sun shines, and green things grow again. That's the way of it." She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, soft as a whisper, "I want to believe that." "Then stay. Let them talk themselves hoarse. We'll just keep on living." She stood, paused at the door. "Wyatt." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and it hit him like a physical thing. "Thank you for everything, but mostly for seeing me as more than what was done to me." Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the stars and the sound of his own name echoing in his ears like a prayer. The late summer heat had settled over the ranch like a wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. Wyatt wiped sweat from his brow as he mended the chicken coop, watching Lillian from the corner of his eye as she tended the small garden she'd started. She'd pushed back her sleeves and tied her hair up, revealing the graceful line of her neck. When she thought no one was looking, she'd pause to press the back of her hand to her forehead, leaving little smudges of dirt that somehow only made her more appealing. It had been 6 weeks now since he'd brought her home. 6 weeks of shared meals and quiet evenings, of small kindnesses and smaller touches, her hand brushing his when she passed him coffee, his fingers steadying her elbow when she climbed down from the wagon. 6 weeks of trying not to think about what he was starting to feel. The sound of approaching horses made them both look up. 3 riders were coming down the trail, and Wyatt's hand moved instinctively to his hip before remembering he'd left his gun in the house. "Easy," he murmured to Lillian, who had gone still as a deer scenting danger. "Let's see what they want." The riders pulled up in front of the house. 2 were strangers, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those who lived outside the law. But the third, McGraw. Sheriff Colton Graves touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Miss Hart." Lillian's intake of breath was sharp as a blade. Her face had gone pale beneath the sun's kiss, and Wyatt saw her hands clench in the folds of her skirt. "Sheriff," Wyatt said evenly. "Something I can help you with." Graves dismounted with the easy grace of a man comfortable with his own power. He was handsome in a cold way, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink enough, and a smile that didn't reach them. "Just making my rounds, checking on the good citizens of my county." His gaze lingered on Lillian. "Making sure everyone's where they ought to be." "We're fine here," Wyatt said. "Are you now?" Graves walked closer, and Lillian took an involuntary step back. "Because I've been hearing some interesting things in town about how you're harboring a woman of questionable character." The words hit like a slap. Lillian's chin came up, but Wyatt saw the tremor in her hands. "Nothing questionable about Miss Hart," Wyatt said, moving to place himself between them. "No." Graves's smile widened. "That's not what I heard. In fact, I heard she was found in quite the compromising position. Some might say she was advertising her availability." Lillian made a sound hurt and anger mixed, and Wyatt's hands clenched into fists. "Whatever you heard wrong." "Did I?" Graves pulled out a folded paper from his vest. "Because I've got a witness says otherwise. Says she was found all trussed up with a sign that said, 'Stop!'" Lillian's voice cut through like a whip. "Just stop!" Graves turned to her, and something ugly flickered in his eyes. "Why, Miss Hart, you seem upset. Perhaps you'd like to tell your side of things. I'm always willing to listen to a lady in distress." "You know exactly what happened," she said, so quiet Wyatt almost missed it. "You were there." The words hung in the air like smoke. Graves's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, and Wyatt felt understanding hit him like a fist to the gut. Now, Graves said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You want to be careful about making accusations you can't prove. A woman like you, with your reputation already in tatters. Well, who's going to believe you?" "Get off my land," Wyatt said. "Your land?" Graves laughed. "McGraw, you might want to check your property records. Amazing how paperwork can get misplaced. Errors can happen. A man might find he doesn't own what he thinks he does." The threat was clear. Wyatt felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. "I said get off my land." Graves studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "For now. But this isn't over. A man makes choices. McGraw. Sometimes those choices have consequences." He mounted his horse, tipped his hat to Lillian with mocking courtesy. "Ma'am, I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again real soon." They watched the riders disappear into the heat shimmer, dust hanging in the air like a promise of trouble to come. Lillian was shaking. Wyatt reached for her, but she jerked away. "Don't." She wrapped her arms around herself. "He's right. About everything. I am ruined. I am—" "You're nothing he says you are." She laughed, bitter as alkali water. "Aren't I?" He made sure of that. Him and his men, they wanted information about a gold shipment Edward was supposed to know about. When I couldn't tell them anything, She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Lillian. Her name came out rough, pained. They left me there, with that sign, like I was nothing, less than nothing. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't seem to notice. And now he's here. He followed me here. And he'll destroy you too. Let him try. She whirled on him. You don't understand, he's the law. He can do whatever he wants. He can take your land, your reputation, your life. And he will, just because you helped me. Then I guess we'd better stop him first. She stared at him. Who's going to stand against the sheriff? Who's going to believe me over him? Wyatt didn't have an answer for that. But looking at her brave and broken and beautiful, despite everything he knew he'd try anyway, that night, neither of them had much appetite for supper. They pushed food around their plates while the clock ticked too loud in the silence. I'll leave tomorrow, Lillian said finally. Head for California like I planned. If I'm gone, maybe he'll leave you alone. No. Wyatt. No. He pushed back from the table. You think I'm the kind of man who'd let you face that bastard alone. You think that little of me. I think you're the kind of man who doesn't deserve to lose everything because of me. He crossed to where she sat, knelt beside her chair. It put them at eye level, and he could see the pain and fear and stubborn courage warring in her eyes. Lillian, look at me. She did, reluctantly. I lost my sister to fever, lost my fiancé to a man with more money and fewer scars, lost my faith in a lot of things. But I found you, and that means something. You mean something to me. Her breath hitched. You shouldn't say such things. Why not? Because some men decided to break you, because the world says you're ruined. He took her hands, careful, as if she might shatter. You're not ruined. You're the strongest woman I've ever met. And if Graves thinks he can come here and threaten you, threaten us, then he's got another think coming. Us, the word was barely a whisper. If you'll have me, if you'll let me stand with you. She searched his face, and he let her see everything, the growing feelings he'd tried to hide, the fury at what had been done to her, the determination to protect her no matter the cost. Oh, Wyatt, she touched his face with trembling fingers. You beautiful, foolish man. Don't you see that's exactly what he wants? For you to care? Because then he can hurt you by hurting me. Already too late for that. She leaned forward until their foreheads touched. For a moment, they breathed the same air, existed in the same space between heartbeats. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I, but we'll be scared together. She pulled back, and something had shifted in her expression. The despair was still there, but underneath it, a spark of the fighter he'd glimpsed that day at church. All right, she said, together. That Sunday, they went to church again. If Graves' visit had accomplished anything, it was to strengthen their resolve not to be driven into hiding. But when they arrived, the atmosphere was different. Conversations didn't stop, they intensified. And the looks weren't just curious or disapproving, they were hostile. Reverend Morrison's sermon was about Jezebel. Halfway through, as he warmed to his theme of painted women who led good men astray, Lillian stood. The church went silent. She walked to the front, her steps measured and deliberate. Morrison faltered, clutching his Bible like a shield. Reverend, she said, her voice carrying to every corner, you speak of sin and judgment, but I wonder when you stand before God, will he ask about my sins, or will he ask why you, a man of the cloth, chose cruelty over compassion? Miss Hart, this is highly irregular. Yes, let's talk about irregular. She turned to face the congregation. Let's talk about a sheriff who abuses his power, who takes what isn't freely given and then brands his victims as sinners to cover his own crimes. Gasps rippled through the pews. Misses. Foster half rose from her seat. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. Lillian's voice never wavered. You've already decided what I am. But I know what he is, and some of you know it too. You've seen how he operates, heard the whispers about other women who left town suddenly, who wouldn't say why. A murmur ran through the crowd. Wyatt saw a few faces, younger women mostly go pale with recognition. Enough, Morrison thundered. This is a house of God, not a place for wild accusations. Then perhaps you should ask why God's house has become a den of hypocrites. Lillian looked him dead in the eye. I came here seeking sanctuary. Instead, I found judgment. I looked for Christ's love and found only Pharisees. She walked back down the aisle, and this time, Wyatt noticed, not everyone looked away. Mrs. Baker, the blacksmith's young wife, met her eyes with something like understanding. Old Samuel Green nodded slightly as she passed. Outside, Wyatt caught up with her at the wagon. She was shaking, but her head was high. That was, he searched for words. That was something. That was probably stupid. But she was smiling, fierce and wild. But oh, it felt like flying. He helped her into the wagon, and as they pulled away, he saw people spilling out of the church, arguing. The congregation that had been united in their judgment was fracturing, doubt creeping in like water through a dam. You know Graves won't let this stand, he said. I know. She looked at him, and her smile softened into something tender. But I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting him win. Whatever comes next, at least I spoke the truth. Wyatt reached over and took her hand. She laced their fingers together, and they rode home like that, connected by touch and purpose and something that might have been hope. That night, as they sat on the porch in the cooling air, Lillian surprised him by moving her chair closer to his. Do you ever think about how different life might have been? She asked. If we'd met some other way. Sometimes, but then I reckon we might not have met at all. And that, he squeezed her hand. That doesn't bear thinking about. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring: Graves's revenge, the town's reaction, whatever storms were heading their way. But tonight, they had the quiet understanding between two damaged souls who'd found in each other something worth fighting for. It wasn't the stuff of fairy tales, but it was real and true and theirs. And for now, that was enough. The morning dawned strange and still, the air thick as molasses and charged with the promise of violence. Wyatt woke to find Lillian already up, standing at the window with her shawl wrapped tight despite the heat. Couldn't sleep, he asked, joining her. She shook her head, eyes fixed on the horizon. Something's coming. Can you feel it? He could. The horses were restless in the corral, and even the chickens seemed subdued. The sky to the south had an ugly yellow cast that made his skin prickle. Weather, maybe, he said, but they both knew it was more than that. Lillian had started packing. Not obviously, but he noticed her few possessions gathered together. Mary's Bible placed carefully in her carpet bag. When she caught him watching, she tried to smile. Just in case, she said, You're not running. No. She touched his arm. But I won't be caught unprepared again. They went about the morning chores in tense silence, both listening for the sound of horses that didn't come. By noon, the wind had picked up, hot and dry from the south, carrying the smell of dust and something else, something that made Wyatt's blood run cold. Smoke, Lillian said, and he saw she'd gone pale. They climbed to the roof of the barn for a better view. There, spreading across the southern horizon like a plague, was a wall of orange and black, wildfire, driven by the wind, eating its way across the dry grassland. How long? Lillian asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Wyatt calculated distance and wind speed. 3 hours, maybe 4 if the wind shifts. Not enough time to get the stock to safety. Then we fight. He looked at her, this woman who'd been broken and rebuilt herself, who stood ready to face down hell itself, and felt his heart swell with something fierce and protective. We fight, he agreed. They worked with desperate efficiency. Wyatt plowed fire breaks around the house and barn while Lillian soaked every piece of fabric she could find, hanging wet blankets on the walls and laying damp feed sacks on the roof. The smoke grew thicker, turning the sun into a malevolent orange eye. The animals sensed disaster. The horses screamed and kicked at their stalls until Wyatt turned them loose, watching them thunder away toward the north. Better to lose them than have them burn. The chickens scattered in panic, and even the ranch dog slunk away with its tail between its legs. "Should we run?" Lillian asked as the fire crept closer, the roar of it now audible like a distant train. Too late for that. Wyatt pulled her against him, just for a moment, breathing in the scent of her hair beneath the smoke. "But we've got a chance. The fire breaks might hold. And if we can keep the sparks from catching—" She pulled back to look at him. "Wyatt McGraw. That's the first lie you've ever told me." He tried to smile. Had to happen sometime. The first sparks arrived like deadly fireflies, carried on the wind to land on the roof, the fence posts, the dry grass beyond the fire breaks. They fought them with wet blankets and buckets of precious water from the well, beating out each small blaze before it could grow. The main fire hit the firebreak like a wave against a seawall, rearing up in frustrated hunger. For a moment, Wyatt dared to hope. Then the wind gusted, and burning debris sailed over their defenses. The barn caught first. Wyatt ran with buckets while Lillian worked the pump, but it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. Within minutes, the structure was fully engulfed. "The house!" Lillian shouted over the roar. "We can save the house!" They retreated, making their stand on the porch as the fire surrounded them. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking thick. Wyatt's eyes streamed tears as he beat at sparks with a wet blanket, dimly aware of Lillian beside him doing the same. Then, through the smoke and chaos, he heard something that made his heart sink. Horses, riders, coming fast. They appeared like demons through the burning haze, Sheriff Graves and half a dozen men, bandanas tied over their faces against the smoke. They reined up just outside the ring of fire, and Graves' pale eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Well, well," he called. "Looks like you folks could use some help." "Go to hell," Wyatt snarled. "Already there. McGraw. Question is, are you coming with me?" Graves gestured to his men, who began unfurling ropes. "Here's the deal. The woman comes with us, nice and quiet, and we help save your place. Otherwise—" he shrugged. "Fire's unpredictable. Shame if it took everything." "No." Lillian stepped forward, and Wyatt saw she'd found his rifle somewhere. Had it trained on Graves? "I'm done running. Done being afraid of you." "You going to shoot a sheriff? Miss Hart, add murder to your other sins." "Maybe." Her voice was steady as stone. "Or maybe I'll just tell these men what you really are. How many of them know about the gold shipment you were trying to find? How many know you tortured and killed Edward Hart trying to get information he didn't have?" One of the men shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Sheriff, you said—" "Shut up, Coleman." Graves's mask of civility cracked. "The woman's delusional? Smoke-addled." "Am I?" Lillian never lowered the rifle. "Then why are you here? Why come all this way to watch us burn unless you've got something to hide?" The fire roared closer, and Wyatt felt the porch boards growing hot beneath his boots. But he kept his eyes on Graves, saw the moment of decision in the man's face. "Take her," Graves commanded. His men hesitated. The fire, the guns, the questions Lillian had raised, it was too much, too uncertain. "I said take her." "No, Sheriff." It was Coleman who spoke, the same one who'd questioned before. "This ain't right. We signed on to fight fires and keep the peace, not whatever this is." "You yellow-bellied—" The rest was lost as the wind shifted violently. The fire, which had been pushing north, suddenly swirled back on itself. Graves' horses reared in terror as burning debris rained down around them. "Sheriff!" one of the men yelled. "We got to go!" Graves looked at Lillian one more time, and the hatred in his eyes was pure as flame. "This isn't over." Then they were gone, fleeing before the fire's renewed assault. Wyatt grabbed Lillian, pulling her back as the porch caught fire. "Inside." But inside was no better. Smoke poured through every crack, and the heat was building to unbearable levels. They huddled in the center of the main room, sharing the last of the water, breathing through damp cloths. "I'm sorry," Lillian said, coughing. "I brought this on you, all of it." "Stop that!" He pulled her close. "Only thing you brought me was a reason to give a damn again." She was crying, or maybe it was just the smoke. "If we die." "We won't. But if we do, I want you to know, these weeks with you, they gave me back myself. You saw me as more than what was done to me. You made me remember who I was before." He kissed her then, there in the burning house with death licking at the walls. She tasted of smoke and tears and life, fierce and sweet, and his. When they broke apart, she was smiling through her tears. "Well, Mr. McGraw," that was worth waiting for. The roof beam cracked ominously. Wyatt looked around desperately for options and saw miraculously that the north wall was still mostly intact. The firebreak on that side had held better, creating a narrow corridor of unburned ground. "Come on." He grabbed the wet blankets, wrapping them both. "We're going through the fire. Through the gap. Trust me." She didn't hesitate, just took his hand. "Always." They burst through the door at a dead run, the blankets smoking, the heat searing their lungs. For endless seconds, they were surrounded by flame, the world reduced to orange light and roaring sound. Then they were through, stumbling into clearer air, collapsing on unburned ground as the fire raged past them toward the north. They lay gasping, watching as the house collapsed in a shower of sparks. Everything Wyatt had built, everything he'd worked for, reduced to ash and memory. "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered again. "Don't be." He pulled her against him, marveling that they were alive, that she was here. "It's just wood and nails. We'll build another. If you'll have me, if you'll stay." She raised herself on one elbow to look at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "After all this, you still want me to stay? After all this, I can't imagine you leaving." She kissed him, soft and sure. "Then we'll build another, together." They stayed there as the fire burned itself out against the rocky hills to the north, watching their old life turn to ember and ash when the sun finally set, painting the smoky sky in shades of rose and gold. They stood together, hand in hand. The ranch was gone, the barn, the house, everything but the stone foundations and memories. But the land remained, scarred but not destroyed, and come spring, green things would grow from the ashes. "Where will we go tonight?" Lillian asked. "Town, I suppose, though after your speech at church." "After my speech at church, I think we might find more welcome than before." She squeezed his hand. "Seeds of doubt. Remember, and Graves showed his true colors today. Coleman and the others will talk." She was right. Wyatt realized the fire had destroyed more than buildings. It had burned away pretense, revealed truth, shifted the balance of power. They started walking north, toward town and whatever came next. Behind them, the ruins of the ranch still glowed in the darkness. Ahead, the first stars were coming out, bright and clear above the smoke. "You know," Lillian said conversationally, "I've been thinking about that sign. Take as you please." Wyatt's jaw clenched at the memory. "They meant it as degradation. But you know what? You took me as I pleased with kindness, respect, protection. You took me into your home and gave me back my dignity." She stopped walking, turned to face him. So maybe they were right, just not the way they intended. Lillian Hart, you are a wonder. No, just a woman who's learned that the best revenge is to refuse to be what they tried to make me. She smiled, and despite the soot and exhaustion, she was beautiful. Now come on, Mr. McGraw. Let's go scandalize the good people of Red Bluff some more. They walked on together into the star-filled night, leaving the ashes behind. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges Graves to face. A life to rebuild, a future to forge from fire and determination. But tonight, they had survived. They had each other. They had proved that love could bloom even in scorched earth, that hope could rise from ashes, that two broken people could make something whole and strong and worth fighting for. The fire had taken everything and given them everything. And as they crested the hill and saw the lights of town spread out before them, Wyatt thought that might just be the best trade he'd ever made. The boarding house room was small and plain, but after sleeping under stars and smoke, it felt like luxury. Mrs. Donnelly, the proprietress, had taken one look at their soot-stained faces and burns and bustled them inside without questions, though Wyatt caught her curious glances. Word of the fire spread quickly. By morning, half the town knew that the McGraw ranch had burned, and that Sheriff Graves had been there when it happened. Coleman had talked, just as Lillian predicted, and the story he told didn't paint the sheriff in a flattering light. Wyatt stood at the window, watching the street below. Already, small groups gathered, voices low and urgent. The tide was turning, but he knew wounded animals were most dangerous when cornered. "You should eat something," Lillian said from behind him. She'd managed to clean up, wearing a borrowed dress from Mrs. Donnelly that hung loose on her frame. The burns on her hands were wrapped in clean bandages. Not hungry. She moved to stand beside him. "They're talking about forming a committee. Mr. Baker said—" "Committees don't stop men like Graves." "No," she agreed quietly. "But they're a start." A knock interrupted them. Wyatt opened the door to find Samuel Green, the old man who'd nodded at Lillian in church. With him was a younger woman Wyatt didn't recognize, pretty despite the nervousness in her eyes. McGraw, Miss Hart. Samuel removed his hat. "This is Martha Jennings. She has something she needs to say." Martha's hands twisted in her skirts. I wanted to thank you, Miss Hart, for what you said in church. About the sheriff. About other women who left town sudden-like." Lillian touched the woman's arm gently. "You were one of them." Martha nodded, tears starting. 2 years back, I worked at the hotel, and Sheriff Graves, he took liberties. When I complained, he said no one would believe me, said he'd ruin my family's reputation. So I left, went to stay with cousins in Denver. But you came back. My ma got sick. I've been careful to stay out of his way. But when I heard what you said, she straightened. I'm tired of hiding. Tired of letting him win. More people came throughout the morning. Mrs. Baker, the blacksmith's wife, brought food and a confession that Graves had threatened her husband's business when she refused his advances. Tom Wilson, who ran the livery, admitted he'd been paying the sheriff protection money to keep his stables from mysteriously catching fire. By noon, the boarding house parlor was full. Ranchers, shopkeepers, working folks, all with stories of Graves' corruption, all finally finding courage in numbers. This is all well and good. Murphy from the general store said, but Graves is still the law. He's got deputies, guns, the weight of that badge. Badges can be taken away, Samuel Green said. I've written to the territorial governor. If we present evidence. That'll take weeks, someone protested. Graves won't sit idle. As if summoned by his name. The door burst open. Sheriff Graves stood there, flanked by 3 deputies, his pale eyes scanning the room before settling on Lillian. Well, conspiracy gathering. Is it? His smile was sharp as glass. Martha, surprised to see you here. Thought you learned your lesson about keeping that pretty mouth shut. Martha shrank back, But Lillian stepped forward. "She's under my protection now." Graves laughed. "Your protection, woman. You can't even protect yourself. Speaking of which," he pulled out a paper. "Warrant for your arrest. Suspicion of arson." "That's ridiculous," Wyatt growled. "Our ranch burned." "Exactly. And witnesses say Miss Hart was seen near the fire's origin. Woman, like her, unstable, given to hysteria. Who knows what she might do?" "Phew, you bastard." Graves's hand moved to his gun. "Threatening a peace officer. That's another charge." The room had gone deadly quiet. Wyatt saw hands inching toward weapons, saw the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move and blood would spill. "I'll come," Lillian said quietly. "No." Wyatt grabbed her arm. "You know what he'll do." She looked at him with those green eyes that had seen too much. "And if I don't, people will die. Good people." She raised her voice. "I'll come peacefully, Sheriff, but I want witnesses, Mrs. Donnelly. Will you accompany me?" The boarding house owner, built like a battleship and twice as formidable, stood. "I surely will." "And me," Martha said, voice shaking but determined. "And me." Mrs. Baker joined them. One by one, the women in the room stood. Soon, a dozen females of various ages faced the sheriff, united in silent defiance. Graves's jaw worked. He'd wanted Lillian isolated, vulnerable. This public arrest, this show of solidarity, wasn't part of his plan. "Fine," he spat. "Bring your hens. Won't change anything." They formed a procession through town, Lillian walking with quiet dignity, the women surrounding her like a protective wall, the men following behind. Windows opened, doors cracked, and Red Bluff watched its sheriff march a woman to jail while half the town bore witness. The jail was a squat building of stone and iron. 2 cells and an office where Graves conducted his version of law. He locked Lillian in the farther cell, the women arranging themselves on benches where they could see her. "Visiting hours are over," Graves announced. "We're not visiting," Mrs. Donnelly said placidly, pulling out her knitting. "We're witnessing, making sure the prisoner is treated proper and lawful." His face went dark. "I could arrest the lot of you." "Could try," Samuel Green said from the doorway where the men had gathered. "But I don't think you've got enough cells." For a moment, violence crackled in the air. Then Graves smiled, cold and calculating. "Have it your way. But come nightfall, visiting hours end, anyone still here will be trespassing." He stalked out, leaving one nervous deputy to watch the crowd. Wyatt pushed through to the cell, gripping the bars. "We'll get you out. He promised." Lillian covered his hands with hers. "I know. But Wyatt, be careful. He's planning something." The afternoon wore on. People came and went, bringing food, comfort, witness. Reverend Morrison appeared, looking haggard. "Miss Hart," he began, "I owe you an apology. I let my prejudice blind me to truth. You spoke of Pharisees, and I fear you were right." "We all have our blindness, Reverend," she replied. "The test is whether we choose to see once our eyes are opened." As the sun began to sink, tension grew. The deputy kept checking his watch, clearly dreading what would come when Graves returned. The crowd had thinned but not dispersed. A core of perhaps 20 people remained, determined to stay. "You should go," Lillian told them. "All of you, whatever happens." "We're not leaving," Martha said firmly. "Not this time." The door crashed open. Graves was back, and he'd brought reinforcements, hard-faced men who weren't deputies, who wore their guns low and easy. "Time's up," he announced. "Everyone out, or I start making arrests." "On what charges?" Samuel demanded. "Obstruction of justice, trespassing, conspiracy. I'll think of something." His smile was feral. "Or we can do this the hard way." One of his hired guns drew his pistol, not pointing it at anyone. just letting it catch the lamplight. The threat was clear. "Please," Lillian called out. "Go, all of you. Don't give him what he wants." Slowly, reluctantly, people began to file out. Wyatt was the last to leave, and Graves blocked his path. "You should have left her where you found her, McGraw. Would have been better for everyone." "The only leaving that needs doing is yours," Wyatt said quietly. "One way or another." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Outside, the crowd milled uncertainly. Night was falling, and with it, the sense that something terrible was approaching. "We can't just leave her there," Martha said. "We won't." Samuel's voice carried the authority of age and righteousness. "Coleman, you were there at the fire. Tell everyone again what you saw." The former deputy he'd quit that afternoon spoke up. "Sheriff ordered us out there, said we were checking on the fire, but he knew right where to go. Like he expected it. And when Miss Hart stood up to him, he wanted us to grab her. Would have, too, if the wind hadn't shifted. He's going to move her tonight," Tom Wilson said suddenly. "Take her somewhere remote. Claim she tried to escape." The same thought had occurred to others. Wyatt felt it in the air the moment when a crowd became something else, something harder and more determined. "Then we stop him," he said. "That's open rebellion against the law," someone protested. "No," Reverend Morrison spoke up. "That's standing against corruption that wears the mask of law. Sometimes God calls us to harder choices than comfort allows." They organized quickly. Men with rifles took positions where they could watch the jail. Women prepared medical supplies, food, safe houses if needed. It wasn't a mob. It was a community finally finding its backbone. Near midnight, it began. The jail's back door opened, and two men emerged, dragging a struggling figure between them. Lillian, gagged and bound. "Now," Wyatt commanded. They rose from concealment like ghosts, weapons trained on the kidnappers. "Let her go." The men froze. One reached for his gun and found 3 rifle barrels pointed at his head. "I wouldn't," Tom Baker advised, his blacksmith's arm steady as iron. They released Lillian, who stumbled forward. Martha ran to her, cutting her bonds while the men secured the would-be kidnappers. "Where's Graves?" Wyatt demanded. One of them spat. "Gone to get more men. Said to take her to Miller's Canyon. Make it look like—" He shut up, but they'd heard enough. Miller's Canyon was where bandits dumped bodies, where evidence disappeared into limestone caves. "Lock 'em up," Samuel ordered. "Use their own jail." As they secured the prisoners, Lillian leaned against Wyatt, shaking but whole. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "Always," he promised. "Always." But they all knew this was just the beginning. Graves would return with more men, more violence. The town had chosen its side, and there would be a reckoning. "What now?" Martha asked. Wyatt looked around at these people, ordinary folks who'd found extraordinary courage. "Now we prepare. Come dawn. Graves will try to take back control. We'll be ready." "The territorial governor," Samuel began, "is weeks away. This ends tomorrow, one way or another." Lillian straightened, that familiar steel showing through her exhaustion. "Then we'd best make sure it ends right." They dispersed into the night, some to guard, some to rest, all to prepare for the confrontation that morning would bring. The die was cast, the challenge issued. Red Bluff had finally awakened to the corruption in its heart. Tomorrow would determine whether that awakening led to redemption or tragedy. But tonight, for the first time in years, justice stood a fighting chance. Dawn came pale and dusty, the air already thick with tension. Wyatt stood at the window of Murphy's store, watching the street. Men were positioned on rooftops, behind water barrels. In doorways, citizens turned defenders, waiting for what everyone knew was coming. Lillian entered carrying coffee, moving stiffly from the ordeal of the night. The bruises on her wrists from the ropes had darkened to purple, but her eyes were clear and determined. Any sign, she asked. Not yet, but he'll come. She handed him the cup, their fingers brushing. The women are organizing medical supplies. Martha's got 6 others ready to help when things go badly. They don't have to. Yes, they do. Her voice was firm. This isn't just about me anymore. Wyatt, it's about every woman he's hurt, every family he's threatened, every person who's lived in fear of that badge. Samuel Green entered, looking every one of his 70 years, but carrying his old Springfield rifle with practiced ease. Scouts report riders massing at the Graves Ranch, maybe 20 men. Hired guns, Tom Baker added. Joining them. Coleman says Graves has been recruiting from the mining camps, promising them a share of whatever they can confiscate once he declares martial law. Can he do that? Lillian asked. He can try, Samuel said grimly. Man with enough guns can do most anything, unless other folks with guns say different. The morning dragged on, hot and still. Then, just before noon, dust rose on the eastern road. They came in military formation, Graves at the head, wearing his sheriff's star-like armor, flanked by hard men who'd sell their mothers for drinking money. The sheriff reined up in the middle of Main Street, his pale eyes scanning the seemingly empty buildings. Citizens of Red Bluff, he called out, voice carrying clear. By the authority vested in me, I'm declaring a state of emergency. There's been insurrection against lawful authority. Anyone bearing arms against the sheriff's office will be shot on sight. Silence answered him. The town held its breath. I know you're listening. Graves continued. You've been led astray by a manipulative woman and her lover. Surrender them now, and I'll show leniency. Continue this foolishness, and you'll all hang for treason. From the church steeple. Reverend Morrison's voice rang out. The only treason here is yours, Colton Graves. Treason against the oath you swore, against the people you promised to protect. Graves' face darkened. Morrison, you old fool, come down from there before... Before what? Samuel Green stepped into view from the bank doorway, rifle steady. Before you add murdering a minister to your crimes. More people emerged. Tom Baker from his smithy, Murphy from his store, men and women standing firm despite the armed riders filling their street. You're outnumbered, Graves snarled. Are we? Wyatt stepped out from the saloon, and at his signal, rifle barrels appeared in windows, on roofs, from behind cover. The hired guns shifted nervously as they realized they'd ridden into a box. Graves' hand moved to his pistol. McGraw, should have known you'd be at the center of this. Let's end this clean, Wyatt said. You and me. Winner walks away. Loser leaves town forever. You challenging the law. I'm challenging a corrupt man who hides behind a badge. Question is, are you man enough to face me without your hired dogs? The insult hit home. Graves's pride, his fatal weakness, flared hot. You think you can take me, ranch hand? Only one way to find out. But before Graves could respond, Lillian emerged from the boarding house. She walked straight-backed down the middle of the street, placing herself between the two groups. No, she said clearly. No more violence in my name. Lillian, get back, Wyatt started. I said no. She turned to face the crowd, her voice carrying strong. This is my fight more than anyone's. Sheriff Graves, you destroyed my life. You murdered my husband. You tried to break me, but I'm still here, still standing, and I demand justice. Graves laughed, ugly and sharp. Justice, you're a soiled dove who... I am Lillian Hart, she interrupted, voice ringing like steel. Widow of Edward Hart, whom you tortured and killed searching for gold that never existed. I am the woman you assaulted and abandoned with a sign meant to destroy me. I am your victim, Sheriff, but I am not your conquest. The street had gone deadly quiet. Even the horses stood still. You want to tell stories, Graves dismounted, walking toward her. Let me tell one. About a woman who tempted good men, who— "Coleman," Lillian called out. "Tell them about the Murphy Gold shipment, the one that was supposed to come through last spring." Coleman stepped forward from where he'd been watching. "There was no shipment. Sheriff made it up, used it as excuse to question folks passing through. The Hart couple was just unlucky traveling alone. Looked prosperous enough to maybe be carrying valuables." "You're listening to a turncoat deputy," Graves spat. "Man who broke his oath." "What about me?" A new voice. Martha Jennings, stepping out to stand beside Lillian. "Will you call me a liar, too? Tell them I wanted what you did to me?" "Or me, Mrs." Baker joined them. "When you threatened to ruin my husband's business unless I entertained you." One by one, women emerged, some young, some old, all carrying the weight of silence finally broken. They formed a line beside Lillian, facing down the sheriff and his men. "Lies," Graves said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Conspiracy of harlots and— Sheriff Colton Graves." The voice came from behind his men. A stranger in a black suit rode through, followed by 6 men wearing federal badges. "I'm Marshal Theodore Blackwood, United States Marshal's Office. I'm here investigating reports of corruption and abuse of power." The hired guns immediately began backing their horses away. Federal marshals meant real law, not the local variety that could be bought or bullied. "Marshal," Graves tried to recover. "These people are in rebellion. I need your help." "What you need, Sheriff, is to answer some questions, starting with the deaths of Edward and Lillian Hart, reported to us by letter 2 days ago." "But she's—" Graves turned, saw Lillian standing tall and alive, and understanding dawned. "You wrote before the fire. You knew I'd come." "I hoped justice would come," Lillian said. "Turns out I was right." Blackwood dismounted, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Sheriff Graves, I'm placing you under arrest for murder, assault, corruption, and abuse of office. You'll stand trial in federal court." "You can't. This is my town." "Not anymore," Samuel Green said quietly. Graves went for his gun. Later, witnesses would argue about who fired first, whether it was Wyatt, protecting Lillian, or Tom Baker, or one of the men on the rooftops. But the result was the same. Colton Graves spun and fell, his pistol never clearing leather, his blood soaking into the dusty street he'd ruled through fear. His hired guns threw down their weapons, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. The federal marshals rounded them up with practiced efficiency, while Doc Harrison knelt beside Graves. "He's gone," the doctor announced after a moment. Nobody mourned. Marshal Blackwood surveyed the scene, his gaze settling on Lillian. "Ma'am, I'll need your testimony. Full account of what happened." "You'll have it," she promised. "All of it." The marshal nodded, then addressed the crowd. "Town'll need a new sheriff. Suggest you folks handle that proper, like, electoral process, not mob rule." "Coleman would do fine," someone called out, and others took up the cry. The former deputy looked stunned, then humbled as the town he'd helped save offered him redemption. As the marshals led the prisoners away and the crowd began to disperse, Wyatt found Lillian standing alone by the spot where Graves had fallen. She wasn't looking at the blood, but at the horizon beyond the town. "It's over," he said softly. "Is it?" She turned to him, and he saw tears on her cheeks. "Can it ever really be over? What he did, what they all did, I'll carry that forever." "You'll carry it," he agreed, pulling her close. "But you won't carry it alone. Not anymore." She leaned into him, and they stood there as the town slowly returned to life around them. Shops reopened, children emerged from hiding, and the ordinary business of living resumed. "McGraw," Marshal Blackwood called. "Heard you lost your ranch to fire." "Yes, sir. Also heard it might have been arson. Graves is doing. Maybe—" Wouldn't surprise me. The marshal studied them both. Federal government sometimes compensates folks wrongfully harmed by corrupt officials. Might be you could file a claim. Might be it'd get approved right quick, given the circumstances. It wasn't justice. Exactly nothing could give back what had been taken. But it was something. As the marshal rode away with his prisoners, Lillian looked up at Wyatt. "So what now?" "Now," he smiled, the first real smile in what felt like ages. "Now we rebuild. The ranch, our lives, everything. But first," he cupped her face gently. "First, I've got something to ask you." Her breath caught. "Wyatt, marry me. Lillian Hart? Not because you need protection, not because of what anyone thinks. Because I love you. Because you're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Because I can't imagine facing another day without you beside me." She was crying again, but smiling through it. "You beautiful fool. Yes, yes, of course, yes." He kissed her there in the street, in front of God and Red Bluff and everyone. And nobody whispered scandal. They cheered instead, because sometimes love born from ashes is the strongest kind. Later, as they stood before Reverend Morrison in the little church, with Martha as bridesmaid and Coleman as witness, Wyatt thought about the strange turns life could take, how a storm could bring salvation, how the worst moment of your life could lead to the best. "Do you, Wyatt, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Morrison asked, beaming with genuine joy. "I do." "And do you, Lillian, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice was clear and certain. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined, let no man put asunder." As they kissed to seal their union, the church bells rang out over Red Bluff, not in alarm this time, but in celebration. The sound carried across the desert, over the ashes of the old ranch, into the vast sky where storms were born and died. Outside, the town they'd helped save waited to congratulate them. But for this moment, there was just the two of them, holding tight to love that had survived the worst the world could offer. "Mrs. McGraw," Wyatt whispered against her lips. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," she whispered back. "So do I." They walked out of the church into blazing sunshine, into a future bright with promise. Behind them lay ashes and pain. Ahead stretched years of building, growing, living. Together. 6 months had passed since the fire, since the confrontation that freed Red Bluff from Colton Graves' shadow. The compensation from the federal government had come through as Marshal Blackwood promised. And with it, Wyatt and Lillian had rebuilt not just structures, but a life. The new house stood on the same foundation as the old, but it was larger, airier, with windows that caught the morning light and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Lillian had insisted on a garden, and now green things grew where once there had been only ash tomatoes and beans, squash and corn, and a riot of wildflowers that drew bees and butterflies. This morning, Wyatt stood at the corral fence, watching Moses graze alongside Belle and the new horses they'd acquired. The barn, rebuilt stronger than before, cast its shadow across ground that showed no trace of burning. Nature had a way of healing itself, given time and care. "You'll wear a hole in that fence post, leaning on it so hard." He turned to find Lillian approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She moved differently now, still graceful, but without the careful wariness that had marked her first months here. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by something that might have been peace. "Just thinking," he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Dangerous habit. She leaned against the fence beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she favored. "What about how different everything is, how different we are." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Better different or worse?" "Better, definitely better." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses, listening to the ordinary sounds of a working ranch chicken scratching, the windmill creaking, life going on as it should. Letter came from Martha, Lillian said eventually. She and Coleman set a date, September wedding. Good for them. Coleman had made a fine sheriff, fair and honest in ways Graves had never been, and Martha had found her voice, becoming a leader among the town's women, organizing everything from church socials to voter registration drives. She asked if I'd stand up with her again. Are you going to? Of course, Lillian smiled. Though I warned her I'm not much for luck. Last wedding I was in, the groom died. Lillian. I can joke about it now, she said softly. Edward would want me to. He had a sense of humor about most things. She touched the simple gold band on her finger. Wyatt had insisted she keep wearing it alongside the new one he'd given her. He would have liked you, I think, would have been glad I found you. I hope so. I know so. She turned to face him fully. Wyatt, I need to tell you something. Something in her tone made his chest tighten. You all right? She took a breath, and suddenly she was smiling, bright as sunrise. I'm expecting. The world seemed to stop. The coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the hard ground. You're going to have a baby. Your baby. Our baby. She was laughing now, at his expression, at the joy of it. Doc Harrison confirmed it yesterday. Probably December, he thinks. Wyatt pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, pouring all his wonder and love and fierce protectiveness into it. A baby, he said when they broke apart. Our baby. You said that already. Bear with repeating. He touched her still flat stomach reverently. How do you feel about it? Her expression softened. Terrified? Thrilled? Everything all at once. She covered his hand with hers. For so long. I thought I'd never have this. A home, a family, a future. And now. Now you have all of it. We have all of it, she corrected. We built this together. Remember, that evening, they sat on the porch as had become their habit, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The monsoons had been good this year, leaving the land greener than anyone could remember. Life flourished where death had once reigned. I've been thinking about names, Lillian said, her hands resting on her stomach in that instinctive way of expectant mothers. Already? If it's a boy, I'd like to call him Samuel, after Samuel Green. The old man had died peacefully in his sleep just a month ago, having lived to see justice done and peace restored. The whole town had turned out for his funeral, honoring a man who'd stood for righteousness when it cost to do so. Samuel McGraw. Wyatt tried it out. I like it. And if it's a girl? Grace. Her voice was soft but certain. Because that's what this whole life has been. Grace I didn't deserve. Couldn't earn, but received anyway. Grace McGraw, he smiled. That's perfect. A rider appeared on the horizon, and they watched as it resolved into Reverend Morrison. The minister visited regularly now, he and Wyatt having formed an unlikely friendship born from shared trials. Evening, folks, Morrison called as he dismounted. Hope I'm not intruding. Never, Lillian assured him. Coffee, if it's not too much trouble. As she went inside, Morrison settled into the spare chair with a contented sigh. You know, McGraw, 6 months ago I wouldn't have believed this. The peace of it, I mean, things change. They do indeed. Morrison pulled out his pipe. Speaking of which, I've had a letter from the territorial bishop. They're impressed with how our little church stood against corruption. Want to feature our story in the church magazine. What did you tell them? That it wasn't the church that stood tall, it was the people. One woman in particular, who reminded us what courage looks like. Lillian returned with coffee and cookies. Settling back into her chair. What's this about courage? Just telling your husband here that you've made us all famous. Or infamous, depending on how you look at it. She laughed. I'll take infamous if it means other women might find strength to speak up. Already happening, Morrison assured her. Had a letter from a minister in Tucson. Woman in his congregation came forward about abuse from a local official after hearing about what happened here. They talked as darkness fell and stars emerged. About the town, about the future, about the 1,000 small things that made up a life. Eventually, Morrison took his leave, and they were alone again with the vast night around them. Do you ever regret it? Lillian asked suddenly. Taking in a stranger that day. All the trouble that followed. Wyatt considered the question seriously. Only thing I regret is that you had to suffer what you did, but taking you in, loving you, building this life with you. He shook his head. That's the best decision I ever made. She rose and moved to sit in his lap, something she did more easily now that propriety was satisfied by wedding rings. You saved me, you know. No. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. We saved each other. She kissed him, soft and sweet, and they sat entwined while the night deepened around them. Inside Lillian, new life grew. Around them, the ranch thrived, and somewhere in the darkness, a mockingbird began to sing, pouring out its heart to the stars. What are you thinking? She asked, feeling him smile against her hair. About that sign, take as you please, remembering how angry it made me. And now I think maybe it was prophecy, because I did take you into my home, my heart, my life, and you took me right back. We took each other as we pleased with love, respect, partnership. Making something beautiful from something ugly, she murmured. That's a kind of justice, too. The best kind. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another, their wild songs echoing across the desert. But here on the porch, in the circle of light cast by their home, there was only peace. Tell me about the future, Lillian said. What do you see? Wyatt tightened his arms around her, around their unborn child, around all the promise the world could hold. I see children playing in that garden. I see crops growing tall and cattle growing fat. I see us growing old together on this porch, still watching sunsets, still finding things to talk about. And the past. The past is prologue. It brought us here, shaped us, tested us, but it doesn't define us. Not anymore. She sighed contentedly. I love you, Wyatt McGraw. I love you too, Lillian McGraw, today, tomorrow, and all the days after. They stayed on the porch until the moon rose full and bright, bathing the desert in silver light. The land that had seen so much pain and struggle now bore witness to something different love that had grown from ashes, hope that had survived the burning, and the quiet triumph of two souls who had chosen to build rather than break. Inside, the house waited warm, safe, filled with the promise of laughter and life to come. Outside, the desert breathed its ancient rhythms, eternal and enduring. And there, balanced between wilderness and hearth, Wyatt and Lillian McGraw faced their future together, unafraid. In the distance, thunder rumbled not threat this time, but promise. The rains would come again, the land would bloom again, and life would continue its eternal dance of endings and beginnings. Grace, Lillian had said, grace unearned but freely given. As the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the world clean once more, Wyatt couldn't think of a better word for it. Their story had begun with rescue and grown through trial. It would continue with joy, with children's laughter, with the ordinary miracles of daily life. The woman marked for shame had become a wife honored and cherished. The lonely cowboy had found his heart's home. And, in the end, that was the greatest justice of all, that love could triumph over hate, that broken people could build something whole, that even in the harshest desert, beauty could bloom. The rain came harder now, and they retreated inside, closing the door on the past and opening their arms to whatever tomorrow might bring. Together, always together. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this journey through the American West, where love bloomed from the ashes of injustice. I hope Wyatt and Lillian's story touched your heart as it did mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow Wild West enthusiasts from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on this tale of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of love. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the sunset and believing in the beauty of new beginnings.